Hi, this is Christy Wellborn, and you're listening to EstesParkRadio.com. I would like to welcome back John Meisner with Estes Park Archives. Welcome, John. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
We loved your story about the fire at the Stanley Hotel, Part 1 and 2. That was great. Now we're talking about another
We're
hotel
talking about
fire?
another hotel, and this was a big hotel fire. This was the Lewiston Hotel fire.
I don't even know where it was.
The Lewiston is at the west end of town. So do you know where Tregent Park is, where Performance Park? If you just look up to the north, to that bluff there, that's where the Lewiston used to be. Very prominent, right on that knoll. Very fancy hotel, built by a gentleman named A.D. Lewis, and then expanded. He first built the first structure in 1915 and then expanded in 1920. So the reason we're interested in it right now is because we're coming up on the 70th anniversary in September of the big Lewiston Hotel fire. And that was a gigantic fire that people in town still remember, because it was going on during the school. It started in the afternoon of the 4th, about 1:30.
What year are we talking about?
1941, just before we entered World War II. And it had closed for the season. It was a seasonal hotel. And there's some question as to what started, but it clearly started up high, like on the top floor, which was the 4th floor. It was a big hotel, and burned very hot and very quickly. And the thing that was most concerning to Estes Park was, it was very windy that day, and so the wind was blowing embers and ashes all over town, and downtown at that time was mostly wooden structures. So every fire department within a 50-mile radius was called. It was a big fire. I don't know what we call those, 4-alarm or 5-alarm fires. And so Loveland came up, and Fort Collins came up, and Berthoud came up. Anybody that had a fire department besides Estes Park came up. The problem was, because it was up kind of on this knoll, there wasn't a lot of access from particular directions. Certainly from the south, there was no way you could come from the south to get at it. You had to go from the east was the best direction, or you could have come from the north, but there weren't any hydrants close by. So it burned within an hour and a half. It was just, they gave up. They said, the only thing we're going to do now is spray water on the surrounding structures and keep them wet so that they don't start on fire as well. One of the better stories is, and I think it's probably true, although this is, people tend to go overboard with saying there wasn't anything left from the fire, is that Pete Hondius, who's still in town, was over and the football team was practicing. So they went over to see if they could, because it started up high, so where there were still things on the first and second floor that people went in and tried to get out furniture or the piano or dishes or whatever. And in some cases were throwing them out the second floor, and so they just get destroyed when they hit the ground. So that wasn't helpful. But he said by the time that the football team got there, the only thing that they could rescue was a 5-gallon tub of ice cream from the kitchen. So the boys sat out there in their football uniforms and ate ice cream and watched the Lewiston burn. In fact, there were quite a few things pulled out, so that when you go back to the trail from the Friday after the fire and then the following Friday, there's warnings about looting and about going up and taking these pieces of furniture or whatever was left from the fire that had been rescued, because that was still the property of the Lewiston. So that's the end of the story, and the other thing is the speculation about how the fire started and whether it was an intentionally set fire or whether it was just an accidental fire. The beginning is the story of A.D. Lewis, and A.D. Lewis, for whom the Lewiston was named, is an interesting person. He was one of Estes Park's early mayors. He became very wealthy very quickly. And so the thing that we're most interested in is, when he came to Estes Park, and he came in 1911, did he have this money to build this hotel and then later acquire these other hotel properties in town? Was he helped by a gentleman named Roe Emery, who was the head of the Rocky Mountain Parks Transportation Company that had all the money from all of the transportation of tourists up into Estes Park? Or where was his wife wealthy? And so it's funny, because he comes into town, and in 1900 the census shows him out in Nebraska. His profession is a butter maker, so he's working on a dairy farm, and he's making butter. And in 1910 he's in Loveland, and he's at a bank, but he's not the head of the bank. He's just like a bookkeeper at the bank. By 1911, he's been promoted to cashier, which is the same thing as a manager of a bank now, in Loveland. And then we had a bank up in Estes Park that started in 1908, and the head cashier at that bank was very ill. And so he went back to Michigan to try to get better. And I think probably at that time the bank director said, let's get this A.D. Lewis from Loveland to come up and kind of temporarily take over. Well, it turned into his permanent job starting in 1911. So he is the Estes Park banker, and there's only one bank in town from 1911 on. So he has access to funds that way. But by 1915, at his property, which is, again, it's called lots 7 and 8 of Block 10, but it just means if you get on Bighorn Drive and head north before you get to Wonderview, there's a group of condominiums called the Lewiston Condominiums. That tells you exactly where it was. That was the Lewiston Hotel. So when he and his wife came into town, they bought lot 7, which is where the condominiums are now, and it's clear there was some structure there. But by 1915, he's purchased lot 8, which is closer to the edge of the cliff, and is building a structure there. So that's what I call the Little Lewiston. They break ground about December 1914, and it's clearly done by the spring of 1915, and it's a year-round hotel at that time. And it's fancy, but it's not very big. It's not as big as the big Lewiston that's built in 1920, and then by the summer of 1920 is rivaling the Stanley Hotel as far as prices, as far as furnishings, as far as food, as far as advertising that we're one of Estes Park's nicest places to stay. And they definitely were. It wasn't as big as the Stanley, but the rooms were as big, and it was furnished as nice or probably even nicer than some of the rooms at the Stanley Hotel. So this was an exclusive hotel for people to come up, spend the week, spend the summer, as people often did when they came to Estes Park at that time. And so we have great photographs from 1920 and 1921 when the Lewiston first opened. And there's pillars in front, and what it's done is it's just expanded to the east from what this Little Lewiston was in 1915. Mrs. Lewis is the cook, and so she's in charge of the kitchen, and her name was Fanny Anita Lewis. And Mr. Lewis is named A.D., that's his initials, but his name is really Augustus Denby Lewis. About 1919, he switches his profession, his description. He's still at the bank, but he's no longer really in charge of the bank, to a hotel manager. And he's not just managing the Lewiston, but because of this partnership or this friendship that he has with the Rocky Mountain Parks Transportation Company and Roe Emery, he starts acquiring almost every downtown Estes Park hotel property he can get his hands on. So that means the Josephine that was built just a year before in 1918, he buys in 1919. The Hupp Hotel that was then the Park Hotel, which is where Indian Village is now, he buys that, and he turns that into a cafe and rooms and kind of the central location for people to reserve places. And then he brings in his half-brother named Claude Very, and they build and expand the Estes Park Chalets, which is the new Mary's Lake Lodge, what Mary's Lake Lodge is now. So he has that.
Wow.
And by 1920, he's over on Grand Lake side because the Fall River Road is just about ready to be completed. So he buys Grand Lake Lodge, builds and owns Grand Lake Lodge, and a place in Idaho Springs. And it's just like his empire has no end. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, the question is Roe Emery giving him the money for this? Is the Lewiston so successful that he's able to expand? Is he taking out loans from his own bank to do this? Why is he building and buying so much? And the reason you ask this is because by 1929, he's even acquired the Stanley Hotel. So the Stanley Hotel by 1926 had sold to a group from Milwaukee, wasn't doing really well, and then Roe Emery again with A.D. Lewis steps in, and in 1929 they take it over. Now everyone knows 1929 is the year of the big stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression, but A.D. Lewis is clearly in trouble financially even before the stock market crash. So again, our Estes Park Trail at that time doesn't ever put in much in the way of bad news, but it's clear by 1929 he owes money to Roe Emery, and his places are starting to be up for sale.
That's really interesting. God,
Yep.
You're just so fascinating. It's my history lesson.